Maybe we should start with you explaining why the U.S. Armed Forces actually needed a new field manual for counterinsurgency. After all, there was a manual already on the books dating from 1986. What had happened in the meantime to invalidate whatever that manual included?
I really think we've seen a change in the nature of war, Sean. The Tofflers, Heidi and Alvin Toffler, suggest that there have been three revolutions in human history: the agricultural, the industrial, and the information revolution. And we're in the opening phases of the information revolution now. I think that the change in the nature of warfare occasioned by the information revolution has really dramatically changed all of warfare, but it has changed insurgency and counterinsurgency at least as much as it has changed conventional force-on-force kind of war. And so in the wake of the information revolution, in the age of radical Islamic ideology, we needed a new counterinsurgency manual that took account of those changes, the end of the Cold War and the dawn of a new kind of insurgency. But also we needed to re-energize the force. The 1986 Counterinsurgency Field Manual, really not aimed at the Army as a whole, but at just a portion of it, at the Army Special Forces, which had responsibility for fighting that kind of war in the wake of Vietnam. In the wake of September 11th, the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the big army, the conventional warfighting army, needed to be reminded that counterinsurgency was its responsibility as well. And that's why we took on the task of producing this field manual.
Talk a little bit about how that process was begun, who launched that initiative, and how you got involved.
Certainly. We, as an Army, really recognized the deficiency in our counterinsurgency doctrine in 2003 as the insurgency was heating up in Iraq while I was stationed there. I was in El Anbar in 2003 and 2004. And in October of 2004, the Army produced an interim counterinsurgency field manual, but one that it knew was not sufficient, did not properly account for all of the changes in the nature of warfare, the changes in the nature of the particular wars we were fighting that I just discussed. And the Army announced that it had an expiration date. There was a sell-by date on that field manual, and it was 2 years. It was November of 2006. So the Army promised it would have a new book out by then. And that process began, but really caught fire when General David Petraeus, then Lieutenant General Petraeus, returned from his second tour in Iraq in November of 2005, just about 2 years ago. And at that point, General Petraeus took command of the Army's Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in charge of all Army doctrine. General Petraeus had been an old mentor of mine. I actually wrote my senior thesis at West Point on a corner of his desk, Major Petraeus's desk, and Cadet Nagl in Shape, Belgium, Mons, Belgium, back in 1987. And General Petraeus asked me to get involved and to help with that based on my previous work in counterinsurgency. He looked to Dr. Conrad Crane, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, and his former desk mate. They sat next to each other as West Point cadets in military history 30 years before. And General Petraeus asked Conrad Crane to get involved. And the two of us, along with a Marine writing team under the leadership of Lieutenant General Jim Mattis, who was General Petraeus's equivalent in charge of reshaping the Marines for counterinsurgency warfare at Quantico, that team really came together in late 2005 and in early 2006 produced what became this field manual.
Now, you mentioned a few minutes ago that the previous field manual was more written for the Special Forces community. They have traditionally been the United States military's practitioners of counterinsurgency and, in the form of unconventional warfare, insurgency as well. What role, if any, did they play in the writing of the new manual?
They were involved, but the intent of this book was really to come out of the Special Forces community and have the big Army and the big Marine Corps accept and understand that the tasks at hand, the insurgencies we're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, arguably the global counterinsurgency campaign we're waging as part of the long war, were so vast that they had to be taken on by the big army. The special forces simply couldn't handle the scale and the scope of the responsibility. So we looked to conventional army to write the field manual because it was directed at conventional army, and it was conventional army that was going to have to implement it. So it was largely a conventional army responsibility rather than special forces that put this book together.
Does the doctrine apply also to special forces? Are they bound by it as well?
They are. It is army-wide. However, the special forces had a better understanding of counterinsurgency when we started writing this book, based on their experience and their responsibility for that kind of warfare, so that although this book applies to them, it is perhaps in some places it tells them things that they already know. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted Big Army to write this book, because Big Army did not have the base of knowledge it needed to be effective at this kind of war. Special forces, almost by their definition, are irregular warriors and understand the essence of counterinsurgency, which is that this is not a war that you win exclusively by killing and capturing your enemy. Big Army didn't know that and really needed a primer in that responsibility.
Why not include the Navy and the Air Force as well and make it a sort of a joint publication?
Well, a joint publication is being written now. Frankly, the process of writing the field manual was enormously difficult, just single service, just getting everyone in the Army to agree to what Sarah Sewell in her introduction to this book calls a radical field manual, because it really is a dramatic rethinking of the nature of war and the Army's responsibilities for this kind of war. Getting the Army to buy off on this degree of change in its thinking was enormously difficult. Getting the Marines to come on board as well, even with the enthusiastic leadership of General Mattis, also enormously difficult. When you pull in, the more cooks you bring into the kitchen, the harder it is to agree on the recipe. And so we got the ground forces to produce a manual that discusses how to use ground forces, but also air power. There is an air power annex to the book to provide security to a population, which is the essence of any counterinsurgency campaign. And now that we have that basis of understanding in the Army and Marine Corps, the Department of Defense is having the Joint Staff write a joint counterinsurgency manual, interestingly, based on this book and with the Army in the lead for writing that, because the Army has done more thinking about this problem, perhaps than the Air Force and the Navy have.
You said that it was enormously difficult just to sort of turn the Army's focus and attention towards counterinsurgency and getting the big conventional Army to buy into this. Could you be a little bit more specific about that? Where did you encounter resistance, and what was the nature of that resistance?
The Army, the Army certainly of the post-Vietnam era, was devoted to fighting and winning conventional battles. And it became absolutely the best ground force in the world at that task, as it demonstrated in Desert Storm and then in the March to Baghdad in 2003. However, the very traits that led it to be so successful in that kind of war render it less effective at counterinsurgency. In counterinsurgency, sometimes the more force you use, the less effective you are. The exact opposite of the Schwerpunkt idea that drove the Army's thinking in the wake of Vietnam to build the Army that triumphed in Desert Storm and in the March to Baghdad. So changing that mindset was enormously difficult. And in fact, it's a radical move away from what's called the Powell-Weinberger doctrine of fighting overwhelming short wars with extraordinary military power and then withdrawing. What we learned, I think, in the wake of September 11th was that it is still necessary to have the ability to destroy an enemy army on the field of battle, but it's not sufficient. You have to be able to build a society afterward that respects the rule of law and that does not allow itself to become a safe haven for terrorists. And that capability is what this book encourages the Army and the Marine Corps to develop, the ability not just to destroy enemy armies, but in the wake of that destroyed army, to build up a new government, a new society, a new army that is responsive to that government, so that that society, which clearly was causing a problem in the international community, no longer presents that kind of problem.